Why brother didn't invite me to his launch party the way family normally would. There was no warmth, no connection, just a short cold message that felt more like an order than an invitation. Come, dress like you're trying. No question mark, no please. The way he wrote it made me feel like I was still 16, someone who needed to be reminded how to behave properly in public. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to walk away like I had so many times before, but something familiar pulled me back. It was that same feeling that keeps showing up in places where I know I don't belong, just to prove that I still exist in my family's story. In the end, I replied with a simple okay. Not because I expected anything good to come from it, but because a part of me still hadn't learned how to say no to them. And deep down, I knew this time would be different. The party was held in a stylish loft on Austin's east side, where every detail was carefully arranged to reflect sophistication and success. Exposed brick walls, warm Edison lights hanging overhead, and a perfectly curated bar cart made the space look like it had been lifted straight out of a high-end magazine. Everything felt intentional, polished, and expensive, as if every corner was designed to tell a story of achievement. The guests came from different industries, but they all shared one thing in common. They looked like people who knew exactly where they belonged in the world. Tailored suits, polished shoes, and carefully styled hair. They spoke with confidence, laughed at the right moments, and moved through the room with the ease of people who truly fit in. At the center of it all was Ethan. He moved from one group to another with focused energy, as if every conversation brought him one step closer to his goal. His sharp features and steady eye contact made every interaction feel like a negotiation he intended to win. His startup Flowbridge was more than just a company. It was a dream he had been talking about for the past 2 years, as if it were his destiny. Standing in that space, I realized everything here belonged to him, and me, I was just someone on the sidelines observing a world I had never truly been a part of. My name is Maya. I'm 32 years old. My job isn't something you can easily explain in a few sentences, and it's definitely not the kind of career you show off on social media. I work in cybersecurity, but not in the way most people imagine. I don't sit in a big office, attend conferences, or carry polished business cards. I work alone, in a converted spare bedroom in my house in Denver. My job is to find vulnerabilities in systems before the wrong people do. I quietly scan, analyze, and fix weaknesses that most people don't even know exist. Companies hire me discreetly, pay me discreetly, and once the problem is solved, they often act as if it never happened. There are no public thank yous, no recognition, just silence. And I've learned to be okay with that. My neighbors think I'm just a remote data entry worker. My family doesn't really understand what I do either. To them, success has a very specific shape: a nice office, a clear title, and impressive numbers to share with others. And I don't fit into any of that. I don't have an impressive LinkedIn profile. I don't have an inspirational story to tell at parties. All I have is my work, quiet, precise, and real. But what they fail to understand is this: just because a job isn't loud doesn't mean it isn't important. There are things that keep the world running smoothly without ever stepping into the spotlight, and I'm part of those things. If you've ever been underestimated just because your work isn't flashy, remember this: your true value isn't defined by how others see you, but by what you actually do. If you agree, comment 1 to show your support. In my family, success was never a vague concept. It had a very specific shape, something you could almost see and touch. And that shape was Ethan, my brother. A startup founder, always polished, always prepared with perfect pitch decks, clear plans, and a future that seemed full of promise. He was the kind of person my parents proudly mentioned in every conversation, the way people casually name-drop an expensive restaurant they've been to. My mother collected Ethan's achievements like small, invisible trophies. Every funding round, every meeting with investors, every step forward in his career was carefully remembered and retold with unmistakable pride. My father, on the other hand, would tell his golf buddies that Ethan was building something real, something meaningful, something important. And me, I was the other one, the one who never quite explained her job properly, the one who worked from home without an office, without colleagues to name, the one who once showed up to Christmas dinner with a laptop bag, instead of a hostess gift, a small detail, but enough to invite looks and quiet judgment. My mother often described my work with a simple sentence. She does something with computers. The tone she used made it sound like I repaired printers, rather than did something that required skill and responsibility. Over time, the way they saw me became part of how I was defined within the family. I wasn't directly compared, because it wasn't necessary. The contrast was already clear. Ethan was the success story, and I was the blank space they didn't quite know how to fill. But sometimes those blank spaces hold things others fail to see, values that don't need to be displayed to exist. Ethan found me about 30 minutes later. He moved through the crowd with that familiar focus, as if every step had already been calculated. When he stopped in front of me, his eyes quickly scanned me, my outfit, my posture, the drink in my hand, like he was checking whether I met the standard for tonight. "You almost look like you belong here," he said. "Good," I replied, calmly, in the tone I had learned over the years, treating his half-compliments as something normal. He lowered his voice, as if he was about to say something important. "There's someone I want you to meet." I almost laughed to myself. With Ethan wanting me to meet someone, was never really about me. It was always about image, about how he arranged things in a room to tell a story that worked in his favor. "Who?" I asked. "Garrett Cole," he said, pausing to watch my reaction, which I didn't have because I didn't recognize the name. "CEO of Sentinel Architecture. They're considering partnering with Flowbridge. It's a big deal. Huge. I need this." I nodded. "So what do you need from me?" His smile shifted, subtle but familiar. Calculated. "Nothing. Just stand there." He continued, as if explaining something obvious. "I just want him to see that I come from a grounded family. Good values. You know." I did know. Too well. In that moment, I wasn't his sister. I was part of the story he was building, a detail, meant to make him look better. "Just don't go into your computer stuff," he added. "Just say you work in tech. Keep it vague. Don't make things complicated." I looked at him for a second. Complicated? How? He adjusted his jacket. "As in, don't mess up my night." The sentence landed between us, familiar and heavy. "I won't ruin anything," I said. But deep down, I knew tonight I wasn't just going to stand quietly in his story anymore. If you've ever been treated like a prop in someone else's story, comment too. Ethan walked me across the room, as if he owned the entire space. People's attention seemed to shift toward him automatically, like he was the center. Everything revolved around. I walked beside him, but it didn't feel the same. I wasn't a companion. I felt more like an accessory, something he carried to complete the image. We stopped near a window where a man stood alone, with the city lights stretching behind him. He looked to be in his mid-50s with silver-gray hair, a lean build, and a calm presence. Unlike everyone else at the party, he wasn't trying to stand out, and somehow that made him stand out even more. "Garrett," Ethan said, his voice warm but controlled. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." He turned to me with an easy gesture, as if presenting something only mildly important. "This is my sister, Maya." Garrett looked at me. Not the quick, polite glance people usually give, but a real look. Slow, focused, as if he was trying to remember something. Ethan let out a light laugh, the kind I had heard too many times before. "And this," he added, "is the family's cautionary tale." The air around us seemed to pause for a second. She couldn't quite figure out the whole career thing now. "She just does computer stuff from her living room," he continued, joking, as if it were a harmless story. A few people nearby laughed politely, not too loud, but enough to play their part in the moment. My mother, who had somehow appeared beside us, let out a soft laugh too. "She's always been the quiet one," she added, as if explaining something that should be overlooked. My father nodded calmly, as if everything happening was completely normal. I stood there listening to those words as if they weren't new. Because they weren't. The only difference this time was the audience was bigger. But something was different. Garrett didn't laugh. He kept looking at me, and something in his eyes shifted just slightly. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't discomfort. It was something sharper, focused, like he had just noticed something everyone else had completely missed. And in that moment, I could feel it, something was about to change. Garrett kept looking at me, his gaze steady, in a way no one else's had been that night. There was no politeness, no forced smile, just a strange focus, like he was trying to piece together a memory that had just surfaced. "Maya," he said slowly, as if testing the name. Yes, I replied, slightly confused. He tilted his head, his eyes sharpening. Maya, Denver area code. My heart paused for a beat. Ethan standing next to me was clearly starting to lose patience. Sorry, are you? But Garrett didn't look at him. His attention stayed on me, as if the rest of the room had disappeared. Handle 03777, he said quietly, almost under his breath. The air around us seemed to thicken. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood perfectly. Ethan looked between us, his smile beginning to fade. What's going on? Garrett slowly set his drink down on the window ledge carefully, like he needed both hands free for what came next. It means, he said, his voice calm and certain, I've been trying to find this person for 18 months. In that moment, Ethan's world shifted just slightly, but enough. I took a quiet breath, and suddenly, I was back in those long nights working alone. Hours in front of a screen, lines of code vulnerabilities no one else could see. Everything my family had never valued was now standing right in front of them. I didn't think you'd ever find me, I said, calmer than I felt. Garrett nodded slightly. You didn't leave a trace. But what you did couldn't be forgotten. For the first time that night, I no longer felt like I was standing on the edge of the room. And for the first time, the story Ethan had told about me began to crack. If you believe your true value will one day be recognized. Comment 3. 3 years ago, I wasn't anyone's cautionary tale. I was just a freelancer taking on small contracts, living in a rhythm that no one but me really understood. There was no recognition, no spotlight, just the work and the problems that needed to be solved. At that point, I had been working in cybersecurity for about 4 years. The projects I handled weren't big: a regional bank, an e-commerce startup, a hospital system with security flaws that had existed for years without anyone noticing. The work was good, but the income wasn't stable. My mother called it unstable. I called it honest. I had an account on a security research forum where I used a random handle, 03777. No profile, no contact information. Just analysis, discoveries, and a small reputation in a very narrow community, the kind of recognition only people in the field would understand. One night, while running a routine system scan, I came across something unusual. There were no flashing warnings, no obvious signs of danger, just a door slightly left open in a system that wasn't mine. A small configuration error, but enough to create a serious vulnerability. I could have walked away. It wasn't my contract. No one was paying me for the hours I was about to spend. But I didn't. I sat down, poured another cup of coffee, and started tracing it. Line by line, structure by structure, I rebuilt the entire picture. When I finished, I wrote a full report: what the issue was, how it worked, and how to fix it. Then I sent it anonymously. No one knew who I was. And at the time, I didn't think that mattered. The conversation with Garrett didn't end with recognition. The very next morning, I received a call from his assistant, brief, professional, no unnecessary details. Garrett wanted to speak with me directly. When I called back, he went straight to the point. Sentinel Architecture had discovered anomalies in their system code structures that closely resembled proprietary technology they had spent years developing. Not coincidence. Something closer to duplication. He needed someone who could analyze the code and clearly distinguish between inspiration and theft. And he wanted me to do it. I was quiet for a few seconds, not because I didn't understand the work, but because I understood the consequences. Which company? I asked. He told me. Flowbridge. Something in my chest dropped. It wasn't just a project, it was Ethan's company. I told Garrett I needed time to think. He agreed without pressure. But the truth was, I didn't need as much time as I thought. I just needed to face what I already knew in that moment. I called him back less than an hour later. I'll do it, I said. But before moving forward, I made one thing clear. The founder of that company is my brother. There was a brief pause. I expected him to reconsider. Instead, Garrett simply said, "That makes you the right person." I understood what he meant. Because if there was any chance the truth wasn't as bad as it looked, I would be the one to find it. And if it was, I would also be the one who couldn't ignore it. If you believe that sometimes the truth matters more than relationships. Comment 4. I spent the next 6 days almost entirely at my desk. The screen stayed lit through the night lines of code, scrolling endlessly while a familiar silence filled the room. I went through every part of Flowbridge's system, leaving no detail unchecked. At first, I tried to find another explanation, a coincidence, parallel development, something that could make this less serious than it looked. I wanted to believe there was still a way this wasn't what it seemed, but the deeper I went, the clearer it became in a way I didn't want. The core structure of Flowbridge's routing module closely matched Sentinel's proprietary system. It wasn't just the idea, it was the implementation, the logic, the small details that only someone who had worked directly with that code would recognize. There were variable naming patterns that were too specific to be random identical error handling sequences, and even a partially removed comment that still carried traces of Sentinel's internal project. I sat there staring at the screen, reading everything again, as if hoping the result would somehow change. But it didn't. This wasn't inspiration. This was duplication. And not on a minor level, but at the very core of the system. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a heavy emptiness settle in my chest. Not because I was surprised, but because I could no longer deny it. I had searched for an answer that could protect him, but what I found instead was the truth, clear, detailed, and impossible to argue with. I sat there for a long time after I had finished reading everything. The screen was still on, but I wasn't looking at it anymore. Instead, I stared into the empty space in front of me, where my thoughts began to slow down, then collide with each other. I asked myself a question I couldn't avoid. Why am I doing this? Because it's right, or because I want him to pay? It wasn't a comfortable question. It touched things I had long learned to hide, moments of being dismissed. Words that were meant as jokes but stayed longer than they should have. Cautionary tale. I could have used all of that as justification. And honestly, it would have been easy if I had. But I knew that if I chose that path, I wouldn't be the person I believed I was. I spent that entire night sitting with myself. No laptop, no distractions, just thinking. I thought about my work, how I fix broken systems, not because someone pays me, but because I can't ignore something that's wrong. I thought about the people who built Sentinel's system, the years they invested, and how it had been taken without acknowledgement. And then I realized the answer wasn't about Ethan. It was about me. I wasn't doing this against him. I was doing this because I couldn't ignore a system that had been compromised. Because the truth exists whether it's convenient or not. And the next morning when I woke up, there was no hesitation left. I knew what I was going to do. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. What happened next wasn't like in the movies. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where everyone stood up and argued. It was slower, quieter, but far heavier. Sentinel didn't rush. They took their time building a complete record of evidence, every access log, every timestamp, every line of code, carefully compared. Everything was assembled into a full picture, clear enough that there was no room left for doubt. When they finally sat down with Ethan, it wasn't to ask what had happened. It was to show him that they already knew. At first, he denied it. That didn't surprise me. Denial is the first instinct when things still feel like they can be avoided. But then, piece by piece, the evidence was laid out. No emotion, no pressure, just facts, presented with cold precision. And at some point, the truth became too heavy to deny. I wasn't there. I didn't want to be. I had done my part. And I knew the rest didn't require me to witness it. But I still knew what followed. Investor calls stopped. Meetings were canceled. Opportunities that once felt within reach disappeared. Flowbridge didn't collapse from a single blow. It fell because everything holding it up was no longer stable. And Ethan, for the first time, was no longer in control of his own story. Some truths once brought into the light can never be rewritten. If you believe the truth will always come out sooner or later. Comment 5. Ethan called me that night. I let the phone ring for a while before answering. Not because I didn't know what he would say, but because I knew exactly how it would sound. When I picked up, there was no greeting, no pretense. "You did this," he said, his voice flat and cold, like the conclusion had already been made. I didn't react immediately. I documented what was there, I replied, keeping my voice as steady as I could. There was a brief pause, then a quiet laugh, not one that carried any humor. "You went looking for it," he said. "You chose to do that." I took a small breath. I was asked to review it. And I told them you were my brother before I agreed. I'm not sure why I said that, maybe to make it clear I hadn't hidden anything. But it didn't seem to matter. You could have told me first, he said, his tone sharpening. I paused before answering. If I had, would you have changed what you did? This time he was silent. And that silence answered everything. I felt something shift inside me, an old instinct to smooth things over, to apologize, just to end the conversation. But this time I didn't. You called me a cautionary tale in front of a room full of people, I said slowly. You've been telling that story about me for years. And while you were doing that, you were building everything you had on something that wasn't yours. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I didn't make you fail, Ethan. I said. You were already doing that. There was no response, just a long silence, and then the call ended. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the one who had lost that conversation. The next morning, my mother called. I saw her name on my phone and immediately knew this wouldn't be a simple conversation. Her voice started off soft, familiar, the tone she always used when she wanted things to sound more reasonable than they actually were. I spoke with Ethan, she began slowly. This situation, it's getting out of hand. I didn't respond. I just listened. She continued explaining things in a way that made them sound smaller than they were. In business, especially startups, boundaries can get blurry. People learn from each other. These things don't need to be made into something so big. I let out a quiet breath. That's not learning, I said. That's taking something that isn't yours. There was a brief silence on the other end. Her tone shifted slightly, losing some of its softness. Maya, she said, he's your brother. I closed my eyes for a second. I know, I replied, but that doesn't change what happened. She didn't argue right away, but I could hear the disappointment building beneath her words. You always make things more complicated than they need to be, she said, no longer hiding it. It wasn't a new sentence. I had heard it many times before, but this time it didn't carry the same weight. I'm not making things complicated, I said. I'm just not ignoring them. She went quiet for a few seconds. Then her voice changed again, more practical, more tired. She talked about family, about things falling apart, about how I could still do something to hold everything together. I understood what she wanted. But I also knew some things, once broken, don't return to what they were. I'm not planning to do anything else, I said. I've already said what needed to be said. The call ended without agreement, but also without further argument. And for the first time, I realized keeping the peace for everyone else was no longer my responsibility. About 6 weeks after that party, Garrett called me again. His voice was as calm as before, but this time the conversation was different. He offered me a formal position at Sentinel Director of Threat Intelligence, with the ability to build my own team, a significant budget, and a title that alone could change how people saw me. It was the kind of job that if I accepted, my mother would never again describe as just doing computer stuff. I sat in my familiar workspace in Denver, carefully reading through the job description he had sent. It was good, really good. Meaningful work, large-scale problems. Complex enough to keep me sharp, but the more I read, the more I felt something didn't quite fit. Not because the opportunity wasn't good enough, but because it was too defined. A path already laid out, a role inside someone else's story. I had spent too many years being placed in stories that weren't mine, Ethan's story, my family's story. And now, no matter how appealing it was, I didn't want to step into another one where I wasn't the author. When I told Garrett that, he was quiet for a moment. You could do the same work here, he said. Not exactly, I replied. When you're inside a system, you serve its narrative. I want to stand outside it, where the truth isn't adjusted to fit anyone. There was a pause, then a small laugh. Fair enough. In the end, we agreed on an independent contract, clear projects, defined scope, and most importantly, full autonomy. Interestingly, it was even more valuable than the formal position he had offered. But the most important thing wasn't the money. It was that I remained who I am. Someone who works quietly, sees what others miss, and speaks the truth when it matters. If you believe freedom and self-worth matter more than titles, comment 6. Things eventually settled in the way big things often do, not with a dramatic ending, but with a lingering silence. Flowbridge didn't collapse overnight. It disappeared piece by piece. Investor calls stopped. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were canceled without explanation. A company once described as the future slowly became something people stopped mentioning altogether. I didn't follow it closely, but news like that has a way of reaching you, whether you want it to or not. My family shifted in a similar way. For about 2 months, no one contacted me. No messages, no calls, not even accusations. Just silence. And strangely, that silence wasn't as uncomfortable as I expected. It was quiet. Easier to breathe in than I thought. Then one Sunday evening, my mother called again. This time her voice didn't carry that familiar control, that layer of reason she usually wrapped around things. She just sounded tired. "I don't know what to say to you about all of this," she said. I didn't try to fill the space. "I understand," I replied. She was quiet for a moment, then asked a question I knew she had been thinking about for a long time. "Do you think you were right?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, but because this time the answer wasn't as simple as before. "I think I did what needed to be done," I said finally. "But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt." On the other end, I heard her exhale softly. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't resistance either. We spoke a little longer about nothing important, but she didn't hang up right away. And with my mother staying on the line like that, was already a change. A few weeks later, I happened to drive past the building where that party had taken place. I hadn't planned to stop, but when I saw the familiar windows, I slowed down for a moment. The Edison lights that once filled the space were gone, the interior darker, and the name on the directory by the entrance had changed. Another company had taken its place, as if everything that had happened there was just a brief moment, something that left no lasting mark. I sat in my car a few seconds longer than necessary, looking up at the room where I had stood, where Ethan had placed a hand on my shoulder and introduced me as the family's cautionary tale. I remembered the sound of laughter that night, light, polite, but enough to turn a sentence into a label. Before, those words used to stay with me longer than I wanted to admit. They settled like a conclusion I never got to challenge. But this time, when I thought about it, it felt different. Not heavy, not haunting, just clear. I realized that the story had never really been about me. It was about Ethan's need for contrast to make his success stand out, for a narrative that made his version of things feel more complete. I wasn't the failure in that story. I was just a piece he chose to define in a way that benefited him. And once I understood that, everything felt strangely lighter. The labels people place on you only have power if you accept them. And once you look at them clearly and understand where they come from, they become nothing more than stories that were never yours to begin with. After everything that happened, I realized something very simple, but it took me a long time to truly understand it. The people who try to define you, who place labels on you in front of others, don't do it because they understand you. They do it because they need you to fit into the story they're telling about themselves. You are not the center of their perspective. You are just a part that helps make their narrative feel complete. And when you begin to change, when you no longer fit the role they've assigned to you, they will try to pull you back or rewrite the way they describe you. Not because you're wrong, but because you no longer serve their story. I used to think I had to explain myself, to prove my worth, to make them understand. But now I know that's not necessary. You don't have to argue with labels. You don't have to stand in front of people and correct their version of you. You just have to return to your life, open your laptop, and keep doing what belongs to you. Your work, your value, your truth. Because in the end, it's not what they say that defines you. It's what you consistently do day after day. And if you stay steady, if you stay clear, the system life itself will reveal the truth. Truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to exist long enough. And when the time comes, it will be seen. If you agree with this message, comment 7 to show your support, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.
đừng gần nữa đâu, dừng lại thôi.